We are going to get started. Welcome to everybody. This is the third annual Human Rights in the Field lecture sponsored by Towson University's History Department and the Human Rights and History minor. The Human Rights and History minor hosts two annual lectures that reflect the two main components of the minor, academics and practical experience. Tonight addresses the practical experience as organizations like the American Red Cross partner with the Human Rights and History minor to provide internships to Human Rights and History students. I'm just going to say HRH to make it shorter, Human Rights and History students. Two students who graduated last May with a minor in HRH completed their internship with Kurt Luthier at the American Red Cross. The other lecture series, the annual Human Rights and History lecture, brings to students in the campus community recent scholarship on human rights topics. As this is the fifth year since the launch of the Human Rights and History minor, the Human Rights Committee in the History Department is planning a series of events for spring semester, and the fifth annual Human Rights and History lecture will be at the center of that. As a preview to what we're planning, that lecture will address reproductive justice in Native American communities. So stay tuned and follow us on Instagram. Here's the QR code, or the link is available as well, so that you can see what we're up to. Before I introduce our speaker and turn the floor over to him, I want to give you the context for tonight's event. I had invited Mr. Luthier back in May to speak in October this month. Much of his professional expertise focuses on natural disasters, and back in May, I thought that students would benefit from his views on how human rights are ensured for earthquake or hurricane survivors who may be forced out of their homes and across borders when Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I'm going to say UDHR, when Article 13 of the UDHR states that, quote, everybody has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. I wondered, when humanitarian resources are so scarce in the aftermath of natural disasters, how Article 25 of the UDHR could provide survivors of natural disasters, as it states, quote, that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. Well, this is part of what's called the rules-based world order that emerged following the horrors of World War II, at the center of which was the Holocaust, which nearly wiped out Jewish life in Europe. Much of the rules-based order is aspirational rather than actually effective. The fundamental documents that guide the rules-based order include the Hague Conventions from 1899 and 1907 and the Geneva Conventions from 1949 on the laws of war, along with the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the UN Genocide Convention, which sadly took the United States Senate 40 years to ratify, despite strong push by President Truman in 1948 for ratification. Those, among other documents and treaties, have as their goal, first and foremost, respecting and ensuring civilians' lives are protected even during war. As last week's horrific Hamas attacks on Israeli civilians quickly led to an all-out Israeli war on Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip, I asked Mr. Luthier if he could talk about what international humanitarian law says about disaster relief for civilians during war. He agreed to do that, thought it would be helpful to bring his expertise to students, but also if I could offer some context for what happened, which I agreed to do. Okay, so I want to start with a quote. Let us not today cast blame on the murderers. What can we say against their terrible hatred of us? For years now, they have sat in the refugee camps of Gaza and have watched how, before their very eyes, we have turned their land and villages where they and their forefathers previously dwelled into our home. I'm going to jump to the end now. Let us take stock today with ourselves. We are a generation of settlement, dor hitnachalut. And without the steel helmet and the gun's muzzle, we will not be able to plant a tree or build a home. Let us not fear to look squarely at the hatred that consumes and fills the lives of hundreds of thousands of Arabs who live around us. Let us not drop our gaze lest our arms be weakened. That is the fate of our generation. This is our choice, to be ready and armed, tough and harsh, or else the sword shall fall from our hands and our lives will be cut short. You might think that these words stem from the recent events in Israel and Gaza. In fact, these are the words of then Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff Moshe Dayan in April 1956. The background to this is that a young Israeli security officer named Ro'i Rothberg, who lived in Nachal Oz, was killed in April of 1956. Nachal Oz was in the Gaza envelope, the Israeli communities of kibbutzim and villages and towns established both before and after the establishment of the Israeli state in May 1948, and was also the area of Hamas's violent attacks on October 7th, 2023. In April 1956, Rothberg had caught 4 infiltrators from Gaza who returned to their villages and tried to reap the harvests on what had become the kibbutz lands. He beat them up and drove them back across the border of Gaza. 2 days later, Rothberg was killed. In November 1956, Israeli security forces caught 2 men suspected of the crime, and they were tried in court and sentenced to life in prison. At Rothberg's funeral, Moshe Dayan eulogized the 23-year-old Israeli, recognizing 2 things. One, that in 1956, Palestinian hatred stemmed from the loss of their lands and villages to Israel, and 2, that Israel would have to maintain arms in order to settle the land and build houses and create communities. The cross-border incursions by Gazans at a time when Gaza was under Egyptian military control led Israel to join Britain and France in an attack on Egypt and the Suez Canal, which Egypt had nationalized in July 1956, something then President Eisenhower deeply opposed and forced the 3 attacking countries to retreat from. I share this story in the background to current events, not to justify or condone Hamas's brutal attack on Israeli civilian communities on October 7th, but rather to understand the forces that produced it. Let me take us back for a minute to October 6th, 2023, the day before Hamas's brutal attacks on Israeli civilian communities living in the Gaza envelope. At that moment, Israelis had been embroiled in political polarization for at least 10 months as the country's prime minister and the most extreme right-wing government in Israel's 75-year history had embarked on a legislative process to weaken or eliminate the role of the judiciary as a kind of check and balance on elected Israeli governments. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis had been protesting weekly for 10 months. The right-wing extremists in Israel's government, the ones who publicly supported expansion of illegal Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank, had backed Jewish settlers with support from the Israel Defense Forces in their violent attacks on West Bank Palestinian communities. To assist and protect settler efforts in the West Bank, we recently came to learn that Israel moved regiments from southern Israel along the border with Gaza to the West Bank. Many Israelis had been reacting with horror, calling settler attacks on Palestinian residents of Hawara a pogrom. Israeli violence reached the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, affecting worshippers. While some Israelis take the opportunity to protest the actions of their government, Palestinians have been denied the formation of a state, and thus a real government or even a military to protect them. Such a state was purported to emerge via the peace process called the Oslo Process in 1993, a process in which the United States played the role of sponsor. The Palestinian state was never allowed to come into being. In the Gaza Strip on October 6th, 2023, Palestinians had been in their 56th year living under Israel's illegal occupation and their 16th year of an Israeli-imposed blockade and siege on approximately 2 million people, about 70% of them refugees, many from lands now part of Israel's Gaza envelope. Egypt joined the blockade by closing off the one border exit to Egypt. Israel's blockade was periodically interrupted when Hamas sent rockets into Israeli communities, causing fear among Israel's civilian population, especially in the Gaza envelope. In 2008, 2009, Israel's military responded by launching a military operation, indeed a war, with some 1,400 Palestinians killed in 22 days of bombardment and destruction, including 300 children. Israeli civilian deaths reached 3, and injuries reached about 180. Hamas fired rockets, recurred along with Israeli military operations on the Gaza Strip in 2012, 2014, 2021, 2022. While Israel removed its settlers from the Gaza Strip and claimed it disengaged from the Strip in 2005, international humanitarian law requires Israel to ensure that basic human rights for Palestinians are upheld, including access to basic services like water, food, fuel, as Israel controls the borders and what goes in and out of the Gaza Strip from the land, the air, and the sea. To go back for a minute to the rules-based order, if we're to understand the role of international humanitarian law in wartime conflict, which is the beginning of the segue to Mr. Luthier's presentation, I want to recall what Anne Applebaum wrote just a week ago in the Atlantic magazine. She noted, referring to those documents that I mentioned a few minutes ago, that, quote, the Genocide Convention did not prevent genocide in Rwanda. The Geneva Conventions did not stop the Vietnamese from torturing American prisoners of war, did not prevent Americans at Abu Ghraib from torturing Iraqi prisoners of war, and does not prevent Russia from torturing Ukrainian prisoners of war today. Signatories of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights include known violators of human rights, end quote. And while she listed, Anne Applebaum listed China, Cuba, Iran, and Venezuela, to that we could also add the United States, Israel, and many Arab governments, as well as the Palestinian Authority and Hamas. As Anne Applebaum tried to make the distinction between sovereign state and non-state actors, her article focuses on 2 overall points. One, that state and non-state actors have violated human rights, some with more brutality than others, but all violate the rules-based order that emerged out of the ashes of World War II. And her second point, while the tensions in the rules-based order are evident when you look at most parts of the globe, the rules-based order also provides a structure worthy of upholding and uplifting to try to ensure as few civilians as possible are killed or injured, particularly in the absence of real political solutions. I also want to offer something from my experience as a young graduate student, now a historian. In the mid-1990s, I was studying in Jerusalem when people had hoped that a political solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was on the horizon as a result of the signing of the 1993 Oslo Accords on the White House lawn when Bill Clinton was president. So many mistakes emerged during that process, and the familiar structural imbalance became quickly apparent between a sovereign state, Israel, with a superpower backer, the United States on the one hand, and the Palestine Liberation Organization with little support behind it, which strove to liberate Palestine and for decades was called a terrorist organization by Israel and the US until they decided on negotiations between enemies. Opponents to peace quickly emerged. Hamas-sponsored suicide bombers and a right-wing Jewish extremist assassinated Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1994, imperiling the process. Powerful political forces, especially the United States, did not do enough to ensure fairness in the process and to ensure that the peace process moved forward to make life better in tangible ways, particularly for Palestinians whose lives under Israel's occupation had become untenable. The laws of armed conflict and international humanitarian law were developed to ensure civilians can live lives away from the center of violent conflict and ensure that basic human rights are upheld. My fervent hope is that human rights and thus the minor, and renewed investment to a rules-based order that ensures that peoples can fulfill their right to self-determination and civilians can live lives infringed upon by violence as little as humanly possible. That is what I hope for. We've invited Kurt Luthier, Executive Director of the American Red Cross for Frederick, Howard, and Montgomery counties to deliver the 3rd annual Human Rights in the Field lecture. He comes to this role from the San Diego region, where he had served as the Regional Volunteer Services Officer for the San Diego Imperial Counties chapter of the American Red Cross. Kurt has also served as a senior manager in disaster services at the Red Cross. He specializes in mass care and spiritual care and information and planning, and he helped lead 11 national level disaster responses, including California wildfires, the Oso, Washington. I had to get the WA from the codes of states, make sure I get that right. Washington mudslide, the Moore, Oklahoma tornadoes, and Hurricane Sandy. Prior to the Red Cross, Kurt served for 9 years as a minister with the Church of the Nazarenes Caribbean Regional Office, helping both to strengthen local leadership development and coordinate hundreds of volunteer teams that built churches, homes, schools, and medical facilities in 20 Caribbean countries. He also served in Haiti during the earthquake response in 2010, overseeing volunteer teams who came to assist with rebuilding. Kurt graduated from Southern Nazarene University and has a Master of Divinity from Nazarene Theological Seminary. He is committed to people, and his goal is to create meaningful opportunities for people to give back to their communities. Finally, I want to thank my colleagues, the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, the Chair of the History Department, Dr. Coate, as well as the rest of my colleagues, some of whom are here. Thank you for attending. For all of them, for their support in making human rights and the Human Rights and History program attractive to students and helping make it successful. I also want to mention that after Kurt delivers his remarks, attendees both online and in person will be able to ask questions, and I'll monitor the Zoom chat when we get to that point for anybody who would like to submit a question online. And please note, for any of your friends who couldn't make it, that the College of Liberal Arts is recording this, and it will appear on their YouTube channel, TU Liberal Arts. And finally, we'll have a light reception after. I think it's going to be in that direction. And it looks like I anticipated the number of people perfectly, so everybody should, particularly students, head over and have something to eat. Okay, with that, I turn the floor over to Kurt.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. As we kind of get set up here, thank you for the invitation to come and speak. We did not anticipate the world events that have happened recently, but we will take the opportunity to talk about something that's really important. One of the things that I kept thinking as you were doing this incredible preamble is this is complicated stuff. This is really complex. There's a lot of factors involved. And part of what I want to do tonight is what we do in disasters, right? When a hurricane hits or when we have flooding, we go into chaos. And the really wonderful organization of the Red Cross and all the partner organizations that we work with, they go into that chaos and they create peace, right? And so tonight, we're gonna take all this complexity that we've already kind of been set up to think about. We're going to chew on it, and hopefully we can move to something that is elegantly simple, and that is that humans have worth and dignity, and if you're breathing and you're a person, you matter, and because you matter, there are some really basic things that we need to make sure that you have access to. So we're going to move right into this, ensuring human rights and providing disaster relief, and this is the mission of the Red Cross. So we're going to cover the Global Red Cross movement. We're going to talk about our work internationally, including what the American Red Cross does in its educational mission around international humanitarian law, or IHL. If it's great, I'll save myself some words and I'll just say IHL, and that'll save us some time. We also have in the American Red Cross a division called International Services, which does get confusing with our international colleagues. But we also have in the American Red Cross our disaster department, and we'll talk about mission adaptation. So the things that are happening in the world that are creating a need for us to adapt what we do as we serve our people who are in need. And then lastly, we'll bring it home. We'll talk about some of the things that we are doing here locally and regionally to talk about what you can be proud of, that fellow citizens, people from Towson University who are serving your communities in this. So here we go. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is a global humanitarian network of almost 80 million people that help those facing disasters, conflict, health, and social problems. The mission of the entire movement is to prevent and alleviate human suffering wherever it may be found, to protect life and health, and to ensure respect for the human being. It's hard to find a better mission statement than that. It's pretty powerful. There are three components to this movement. The movement consists of these three parts: the International Committee of the Red Cross, so the ICRC, the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies, and the National Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies themselves. And there's 192 of those national societies. The IFRC, so the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, is the world-based humanitarian network, supporting and coordinating the work of 192 supporting the work of those 192 mission member national societies that collectively and annually reach 160 million people in the world through long-term services, and an additional 110 million people annually through disaster response and disaster recovery programs. The International Federation's 4 core areas of work are: 1, to promote the humanitarian values, so get out there and tell people what we believe and what we practice. 2, disaster response. 3, disaster preparedness, and that can come in the forms of community mitigation, making communities resilient. We'll talk about some of the ways that we're doing that here in the States in a little bit. And 4th, health and community care. And one of the things that I find really fascinating is that by some, we're estimating here, but we think 1 in every 600 people on the planet is a volunteer for the Red Cross movement. So that's pretty incredible. So the national societies, so going to those 192 national societies, these national societies act as auxiliaries. The Red Cross and Red Crescent societies are they're not governmental institutions, nor wholly non-governmental institutions or NGOs. They're auxiliaries. Their relationship to the authorities in their own country is defined by their role as an auxiliary. For example, the American Red Cross is an independent nonprofit. So we actually are an NGO recognized as a 501c3, but we also exist under a congressional charter created in 1905 that requires us to do 3 things. 1, to fulfill the provisions of the Geneva Convention, to which the United States is a signatory, by protecting victims of conflict. 2, to provide family communications and other forms of support to the U.S. military. And 3, to maintain a system of domestic and international disaster relief, including and mandated responsibilities under the National Response Framework, which is coordinated by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. So these 192 national societies are made up of parallel networks of community-based volunteers and employees. And the specific role of those national societies and the services that they provide in each country can vary country by country. For example, here in the US, we're one of the only national societies that actually collects blood and blood products, so platelets and things like that. And we actually provide 40% of the US's blood supply. This is critical for people who have cancer, for babies who are in the NICU, for mothers who have difficult pregnancy, for people who are in traffic accidents. So the blood that we collect and get to hospitals is saving lives. The Palestinian Red Crescent Society and the Mexican Red Cross, they actually operate hospitals and ambulances. And you would have seen, if you've been watching the news, some of those Red Crescent ambulances in Palestine, they're flashing across the screen. They did that work before last week, and they're doing it now. The Norwegian and Italian Red Cross, they actually have a specialty in search and rescue. And so when you have earthquakes in Nepal and you have landslides and avalanches, they can go into urban settings or rural settings and do search and rescue. And then the Kenyan, Russian, and Vietnam Red Cross, they provide care and support for people who have HIV and AIDS. The ICRC, so the International Committee of the Red Cross, established in 1863, it directs and coordinates the international activities conducted by the Red Cross movement, specifically in armed conflicts. So this is the arm of the Red Cross movement that deals with armed conflicts. And it deals with other situations of violence. So as a neutral organization, its mission is to protect the lives, the dignity of victims of armed conflict and other situations of violence, to provide them with assistance. It also endeavors to prevent suffering by promoting and strengthening humanitarian law, which we're going to dive deep into, and the universal humanitarian principles. We do a lot of educating. And the professor already set this up perfectly. These are aspirational things. We are setting the stage for what should be, right? We're talking about the world that we can envision. So the image that you see here is actually from Yemen, and more than 1,000 former detainees in relationship to the conflict in Yemen were transported back to their home country or their region of origin by the ICRC, and the largest extraction operation of its kind, which was a result of the 5.5 year conflict. So how do we do this? Like, what are the guardrails? How do we kind of decide what is in that humanitarian vein? We have our 7 fundamental principles, and I'll go through them quickly. So obviously we start with humanity, right? And that's where we started. If you're a person and you're breathing, you're human, and it's born of a desire to bring assistance without discrimination to the wounded on a battlefield. So if you know anything, start of the Red Cross movement, there was a battle of Solferino. Henri Dunant, who was a businessman, a Swiss businessman, saw the atrocities of what conflict can do, and he said, there needs to be something to alleviate this. And that story is what brought together people on all sides of the conflict to care, feed, do family reunification, tell loved ones what had happened to the people. So it was born on the battlefield. It also is to prevent and alleviate that human suffering wherever it may be found, to protect life and health, and to ensure respect for the human being. And I like this part. It promotes mutual understanding, friendship, cooperation, and a lasting peace among all people. Like, these are hard things that we say are our guiding principles. We go to impartiality. It makes no discrimination as to nationality, race, religious beliefs, class, political opinions. It endeavors to relieve the suffering of individuals, being guided solely by their needs. Priority to the most urgent cases of distress. Neutrality. In order to continue to enjoy the confidence of all, that means both all people, all political parties, all national governments, this neutrality is important because the Red Cross may not take side in hostilities or engage in any type or at any time in controversies of political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. Independence. So this goes right along with that neutrality. The national societies, while they are auxiliaries to the humanitarian services of their governments, and they are subject to the laws of those respective countries, they must always maintain their autonomy so that at any time they are able to perform their work in accordance with the Red Cross principles. Voluntary service. The Red Cross is a voluntary relief movement. So we talked about 1 in every 600 people in the world being a volunteer. Like, we do that through the power of volunteerism with not prompted by gain in any form. Unity. There can only be one Red Cross society in a country, so that's a pretty simple one, but it must be open to all, and it must carry on its humanitarian work throughout its entire territory. And then universality. So we're a part of this global movement where all societies have equal status and share equal responsibility. So let's put these fundamental principles into action. So when the conflict between Israel and Palestine increased recently, the International Federation and International Committee of the Red Cross coordinated with the Israeli Society, which is the Magen David Adom, and the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. And these two national societies mobilized to provide emergency assistance, such as healthcare, the emergency care, the ambulance service, and other critical needs. And we will keep talking about that, and I'm sure you'll have more questions there. So we're starting to get into the international humanitarian law. So the movement seeks to ensure that people in need receive the protections that they are entitled to under international and domestic law. This includes the special protections that certain categories of people are entitled to. For example, refugees. So protection activities of the movement, therefore, are driven by the needs and informed by their human rights. You might have seen some of our symbols. I think the Red Cross and Red Crescent we've talked about already, but in 2005, we actually created the Red Crystal because while none of these are religious symbols, some of them can be confused, and so we gave the option for some societies to actually use that red crystal. And then you obviously also saw the Red Star of David is the one that the Israel uses. So 3 circles of protection. So the first circle refers to do no harm and protection mainstreaming. So both of these are based on the key protection principles of ensuring that all humanitarian activities respect the rights and the dignity of people, supported by a humanitarian response. Again, the IFRC, so International Federation of the Red Cross, their minimum standard for protection is gender inclusion in emergency programming, and it provides key guidance for national societies. And all of this is found in the Sphere Handbook, which if you've done any kind of emergency disaster work, the Sphere Handbook is from the UN, and it's kind of the guiding document. The second circle, which also includes the principles stated in the first, refers to specialized protection activities addressing the causes and circumstances leading to the violations of international law, including international humanitarian law, on such issues that stem from experience, consolidation over the years of a specific. Other specific areas of protection activities carried on or supported by the movement are things like child protection, addressing sexual and gender-based violence, psychosocial support in emergencies, gender equality, disability inclusion, protection of trafficked persons, and provisions of legal assistance. The third circle refers to efforts to include and influence standards, norms, and laws. So this is the work to go and talk to your government about, like, you have already agreed to this, let's see it put into practice. So in this circle, the movement strives to promote and enable an environment that is conducive to the protections of those. In particular, by advocating that humanitarian principles and protection elements are taken into account, integrated in policies, practices, and legislation. So one of the programs that we have is a part of the congressional charter is our work both nationally and internationally. So in addition to doing disaster response, that charter requires that we provide family communication to support the military. We also have something called Restoring Family Links. So that's a program where if a person is displaced or becomes disconnected from their family based on migration, immigration, war, conflict, we can actually provide ways for them to reconnect with their family and establish communication. And that is a really critical piece about if you have somebody in a country and they have sent their loved one off, to be able to know that they reached a place safely is critically important to the mental well-being. So these are free and confidential services. And in FY22, which is actually ended about a year ago, we had reconnected 12,700 families who had been disconnected. So it's really critical work. So now we're definitely into the international humanitarian law. So the congressional charter requires that we fulfill our obligation to teach the public about international humanitarian law. So IHL is a set of rules which attempt to limit the damaging effects of armed conflicts. It seeks to protect anyone who is either not participating in the hostilities or who is no longer participating in the hostilities. This can be civilians, of course, but it can also be fighters who, due to being sick or wounded or captured, and are no longer able to engage in the hostilities, IHL protects them as well. It seeks to restrict the means, i.e. the weapons, and also the methods, i.e. tactics of warfare to limit suffering and destruction. And if you'll allow me, this may be one of the most important things that you hear tonight. IHL seeks to limit the way in which wars are fought. That's an incredible statement. If you think about revenge, if you think about rage, if you think about emotions, IHL is that system of rules that we have all agreed to that limit the way in which we have conflict. I think it's pretty incredible. So how does this overlap with human rights laws? Because IHL and human rights laws are complementary. They both seek to protect human dignity, although they do it in different circumstances and in different ways. So human rights law applies at all times and in all circumstances, and it concerns all persons subject to the jurisdiction of the state. Its purpose is to protect individuals from arbitrary behavior by the state. Human rights law, therefore, continues to apply in times of armed conflict. However, human rights treaties such as the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the European Convention, and the American Convention on Human Rights authorize derogations under stringent conditions from some rights in time of public emergency, which threatens the life of the nation. So what does that mean? Well, it means if there's conflict, the state can limit some of our rights, our right to assemble, our right to freedom of movement, our right to association, and those may be limited during and suspended during a public emergency, but only to the extent strictly required by the exigencies, both territorially and temporally. So, but even in that, there remains a core of rights that may never be suspended at any time or in any circumstances. And in times of armed conflict, a special system called IHL, International Humanitarian Law, comes into effect, and it's a set of rules specifically and especially adapted to armed conflicts. It serves to protect the victims of wars, both, again, civilians, wounded, sick, prisoners, and those displaced, and to regulate, again, to regulate the conduct of hostilities. Many provisions are made for international armed conflict, but far fewer apply to the non-international armed conflicts. The principal purpose of IHL is to protect life and human dignity of civilians and combatants no longer involved in the hostility, to limit the rights of the parties in conflict to use methods of warfare of their choice. The purpose of this limitation is to reduce the suffering and the damage caused by armed conflict. And in doing so, IHL may be said to protect the core of human rights. These core protections include the prohibition of slavery, the prohibition of torture, of inhumane, prohibition of any retroactive. Unlike other rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of association, that may be abrogated in times of national emergencies, the core protections afforded by IHL can never be suspended. So why does IHL matter? Well, it protects civilians. It protects humanity, soldiers. It mandates medical treatment, and it makes a difference. It does this by protecting civilians who are not participating in the hostilities and prohibits wanton destruction of civilian property. It does this by limiting the means and the methods of war, by banning weapons and tactics that cause suffering beyond what will help to end the conflict. It does this by providing protections for those who are out of the fight, whether due to capture or wounds, and it does this by mandating treatment of the sick and wounded. These laws really do make a difference. The Geneva Conventions are likely the most universally recognized international law. Every single country in the world has signed and ratified them. And those who seek international legitimacy they support and take these very seriously. So here we have the 4 fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. It's important to point out that while related to the 7 fundamental principles of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, they're different. And they're also recognized outside of, separately from those fundamental principles. So the principle of military necessity grants affirmative action authority, so affirms what you can do, while the other 3 principles of distinction, proportionality, limiting unnecessary suffering, those principles place limits on the authority. So one important thing to remember is that these principles are not applied in isolation. They actually work best as interlocking principles. And it's complex. I'm going to skip over that video. So here's what we offer. We offer 3 classes to the general public. You're getting the majority of this 1-hour session tonight, but it talks about the fundamental principles of military necessity, proportionality, distinction, and limiting unnecessary suffering. If you attend one of these and you love it, you can also become a volunteer to be an IHL instructor. You can go get in front of a group of people and you can teach. You can do that congressionally chartered work of getting out and educating the public about doing that. There's other ways to be involved as well. One of the things that I think we've really tried to make this connect with where society is. And so we have these really interesting cultural films where there's conflict, right? So this one's Star Wars, but we also have The Mandalorian, Avatar, Harry Potter, Indiana Jones. And really what they look at is international law. They look at this scenario, right? So the narrative that this is doing and overlaying international humanitarian law and having a conversation. Are they following international humanitarian law on Tatooine? Are they following international humanitarian law at Hogwarts? So it's really fun and interesting ways to kind of address that. We have a youth action campaign. There are ways to get involved. This is designed to empower students aged 13 to 24 to learn about IHL, to volunteer to educate their peers. They can explore topics. They foster the understanding and the need to respect human life and human dignity, as well as the complexities of how to apply it to the world that we live in. One of the quotes that was really impactful to me as we've been living through the last couple of days is we have a choice today. We can either sit back and watch the devastation wrought by war and try to make our children look the other way, or we can choose to tell our children that what they see or what they are themselves experiencing is not acceptable, that this is not how it's supposed to be, and that they can behave differently in ways inspired by deep-rooted respect for human dignity, both in peacetime and in the midst of armed conflicts. If you're interested, this is Chris Duffley. He's local. Take a class. You can host a class. If you've got another group that you're a part of, if you have a club, I encourage you to actually reach out to Chris and get that set up. We're going to move a little bit into mission adaptation. So this is both around again, those international services that we do through the American Red Cross and also through the disaster response through the American Red Cross. And to get us started here, I like this quote from Clara Barton, who is the founder of the American Red Cross. And it says, I have an almost complete disregard of precedent and a faith in the possibility of something better. It irritates me to be told how things have always been done. I defy the tyranny of precedent. I go for anything new that might improve the past. And we're talking about this quote because the needs in our world are changing. So we have to continue to adapt our mission. So for us, a lot of that is around climate change, right? So we know this is a critical thing. And in the US, the number of disasters causing $1 billion or more of damage has increased from 3 a year on average to more than 20 a year on average. Like, we are going the wrong way. The American Red Cross is growing our capacity and adapting our mission to address the heightened impact and quickening pace of these disasters that disproportionately impact vulnerable communities. This work extends globally as we continue to partner with other societies around the globe. The last year, internationally, there were more than 101 million people who were affected by natural disasters. Natural disasters triggered more than 430 recognized disasters. 88% of those disasters were climate or weather related. And again, it's not hitting people who have sufficient resources. It's affecting people who are the most vulnerable, that have already experiencing poverty, that are already experiencing instability, and that are already facing situations that might lead to their displacement. We have developed special partnerships with several focused countries supporting projects and local national societies deem crucial to serving their most vulnerable communities. The number of focus countries will evolve as we form new partnerships, but you may recognize some of these flags and you may recognize some of the events that happened in those countries. I happened to be in Nepal in 2015 when they had their big earthquakes. And so those, as we talk about the kind of the changing climate and the different events that are happening around the world, these are the places where the American Red Cross is taking its resources and partnering with a national society. So let's talk about how climate is affecting the US and the people in the US. So 40% of the Americans live in a county in the US that has been struck by a disaster. That's an outrageous number. And over the past 10 years in the US, we have had 8.5 million people displaced from their homes due to disasters. Again, an outrageous number. And again, those that are most affected are, again, low-income families, seniors, communities of color, and people with disabilities. So when displaced by a disaster, these vulnerable families, they experience an increased risk of further going the wrong direction, a further risk of poverty, a further risk of housing shortages, of hunger, and of health challenges. That's another fun video we're going to skip. So what are we doing to address this, right? So the community, how are we transforming our communities to cope with this? We've started the community adaptation program, and it's launching in these targeted communities. So one of the great things about technology is now we have about 30 years worth of data. We know where those communities are that get hit repeatedly. I mean, we could kind of tell anecdotally, because watch the news, like the Gulf is going to get hit every year with hurricanes. We know that California is going to burn every year. We know, but now we have some hard data behind that. And what we've been able to do is we've been able to actually pinpoint those communities that have the highest levels of social vulnerability. And through this program, we're building the capacity and the capability of businesses and the business continuity of local nonprofits who we work with to help increase that community resiliency, to lessen the impact of disaster-caused displacement. So we're doing that around three primary areas: health, hunger, and housing. And again, if you think that this is like right on the nose, I think it's because it's right on the nose. Like, these are the things that people who don't have enough resources are struggling with. And so what we're doing in our mission adaptation program is we're taking a look at the people who get hit over and over, year after year, by these disasters, whose economic prospects are declining instead of like there's fewer opportunities the more times you're displaced from your home. And we're going into those communities and we are saying, how do we broaden the health and mental health access? How do we help your food security? How do we create and solve for food deserts? How do we empower affordable housing? And this is new work for us because primarily the Red Cross in the past has been, if something happens, we will react. And we talk about disaster preparedness, but it really is about individual disaster preparedness, your family's disaster preparedness, or even a business's disaster preparedness. But when we're talking about how do we help people become more resilient, we have to address their core needs, and it's health, housing, and hunger. We do this through planning and development. We do this by offering free trainings. We do this by letting Red Cross volunteers go work and help and amplify the work of other nonprofits. We do this by data sharing and analysis. Is what we're doing working? Should we try something else? Can we iterate? We do this by equipment and material resource provisioning, and we do this by grants. And one of my favorite stories about the grants is if you look at the amount of people coming across the southern border and the strain on local resources to feed them and to house them and to take care of them, we actually found a nonprofit that was already doing food distributions. So their main mission, their core mission was to kind of just take care of the food needs of their local community. But now with all of these folks that are coming across the border, they wanted to do more and they didn't have the resources to do more. The Red Cross was able to say, because we know this is something we want to dive into with you, here's a grant. If you had bigger warehouse, could you do more? And they said, yeah, like these are no-brainer type of things. So we gave them a grant. They went and bought a warehouse and they quadrupled the amount of food that they were able to provide to their community. They also were able to quadruple the amount of storage that they had so that they could make long-term plans. So really easy, fundamental things that are making a big difference. The second example that I have for this about making communities resilient is after hurricanes in Puerto Rico. We know that Puerto Rico has community centers that are actually built to withstand hurricanes, but power was always an issue. And so we actually took recovery money and we put solar panels on the community center that was rated for a hurricane, so that the next time a hurricane came, while everybody's in there safe, there's also power, and there's enough power there so that they can start the recovery. And so when the next set of hurricanes came through, guess what happened? They had power. So super easy ways, but we have to think that way. And I would ask the question, which I would anticipate that somebody might ask me later, is it enough? Are you doing enough? Not yet, not yet. So that's the good work that we have to do. So here are the places that we are doing those community adaptation programs. They're currently in 14 counties and parishes. So we have 3 counties in California. We're in Kentucky, Arkansas, Tennessee, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, a couple of counties in Florida, Oregon, Indiana, and New Jersey. And as we continue to grow, one of the things that I love is that these are people that have expertise not in a traditional Red Cross skill, which would be disaster response, recovery, but these are people that have expertise, PhDs in housing and hunger. And we are investing in people that can go into communities and really start to weave together a resilient community. It's exciting things. So I'm wrapping up, and I want to tell you as we do a couple of things that we do here locally. So we're 90% volunteer. I'm actually an employee, but I'm one of 10% of the people that are an employee. So we have about 5,000 volunteers that are in Maryland, DC, and Delaware. So that's a lot of people, your neighbors that are working with us. A lot of them do disaster response. So the main program is Disaster Action Team. If you have a house fire here in Baltimore City, we have somewhere between 3 and 7 house fires a day. And every time that there's a family displaced, a team of Red Cross volunteers will go out, make sure that they have a plan, make sure they have something to eat, make sure they have something to wear. And we don't really think about how critical that is during the summertime, but it's about to get cold, right? And so if you got kids sitting out on the sidewalk in the freezing temperatures, like these are human rights type of things that our folks are doing day in and day out. Again, we talked about blood. We also teach life-saving skills, so CPR, first aid, lifeguard training. Those are some of the things we do. We have a huge presence at Walter Reed Medical Hospital. So that is where we have volunteers that are doing everything from tailoring fatigues and dress uniforms for people who have lost a limb in conflict, to people that have trained their service animals to come and provide emotional support, and everything in between. We have people there that are experts at actually making prosthesis. So they have volunteers that go into the lab and they make prosthesis for service members who've lost a limb. We talked about IHL. RFL is, again, Restoring Family Links, just putting families back together and putting them in contact. We do fundraising, and that's everything from kids who do a bake sale or a lemonade stand to corporations that want to do it. Because a lot of people think that the Red Cross as an auxiliary, right? So they think we're government funded, and we're not. We're funded by individuals and families and corporations. So the generosity of the public. We also have opportunities for leaders, right? So the board of directors, we have volunteer board of directors, local leadership councils, and ways to kind of continue to reach out into the community and figure out where is a spot in our community that we should be talking about human rights, international humanitarian law, getting somebody prepared and resilient. So we have volunteers that are thinking about that. We do a lot with youth. We have Red Cross clubs at high schools and universities. And here we'll end right here. So here's some of the numbers. So I talked about household fires. We helped 2,200 families. The majority of those were house fires. We collected almost 140,000 units of blood at almost 6,000 blood drives. That's a lot of blood drives every day happening somewhere. We trained almost 166,000 individuals in first aid and CPR. If you don't know first aid and CPR, you should learn first aid and CPR. You can literally save somebody's life. We also provided almost 11,600 critical community services for people in the military. So that's, again, if somebody is deployed in the military, they have a family member who suddenly became ill, getting that emergency message to them to potentially get them to come home so they can be with their loved one. And we do all this, again, through volunteers. This is, you may remember a couple of years ago, there was a building that exploded in Silver Spring. So we worked with the families that were displaced. Some of them needed financial assistance. They got financial assistance. Some of them just needed a hot meal as they waited for their insurance to kick in. So whatever the need is, we are there. We also helped with the buses of refugees that came up from the southern border. Like you may know that was a thing. And so for us, it doesn't matter the motivations. What matters is the need in front of us. And so when you're thinking about human rights, when you're thinking about humanitarian care, it's what is that need in front of you? And so we actually worked with partner organizations to actually help the folks that were being bused to DC. We worked with SAMU, was one of the organizations that we talked to them. We worked with them. We provided cots and blankets and food and water and things like that. And similarly, when we evacuated from Afghanistan almost a year ago, the folks that were coming into Dulles Airport, we were there with volunteers who spoke local dialects and were able to provide emotional and mental support, as well as some of that basic food, snacks, and just a friendly person to kind of greet them as they were coming into a brand new situation. This is Tanika Hoffman. She's a sickle cell warrior. One of the things that we about is, we talk about people who have sickle cell. So like when you think about human rights, you don't think about all the ways in which that is impacted. So Tanika has sickle cell. Sickle cell is a disease that still a lot of people don't understand. I have continued to learn the nuances of sickle cell disease. And one of the things that we know is that some doctors have seen it and it presents like a drug overdose. And so educating not only just the public, but also medical professionals about this is what it is. The pain crisis that comes can look this way, but let's test for that. And we also are doing a campaign where we are really trying to expand the donor base from our Black and brown communities so that we have enough people that have the right protein mix, because what we've learned is that it's more than just the blood type. It goes down to the protein mix, and the right kind of proteins happen to be from people who have similar ethnicities, and that elongates the time in between pain crises, and they can have a much better quality of life. Here's a takeaway for you. Like, this is an action item, right? So if you don't do anything else, download the app, right? The emergency app will tell you when there's a tornado coming. It'll tell you when a flood is coming. You can set it up to talk about, like, if you have a loved one or a family member that lives in a different state, plug in their zip code. It'll tell you when something's going to happen to them. And then the blood app is, you can go ahead. It's, again, another way to take an action. Like, if you want to be good humanitarians, you want to be good citizens of the world, donate blood, save somebody's life. Super easy. Here's my contact information. This information's on the website. You're welcome to call me, contact me, and I thank you. I appreciate it. I look forward to talking to you more in the question and answer.
See what happens if we have both microphones on. Okay. The floor is open if anybody has any questions. Thank you very much, Kurt, for coming and for that very informative presentation. We do have a question on online. Why don't I start there? Do students who attend the online Zoom get marked for being I could make it in person. Yes, sure. If you need to, yes, I will know. And if you have a problem with your professor, I can tell your professor. So yes, that's a good one to start off with. Thoughts or questions? And by the way, your questions could be about either of the presentations or any connection between the two.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did.
So there's plenty there today.
Let's start with Professor Chen.
Would it be, are you referring to like a conflict or natural disaster? Yeah, I mean, I would say both conflict and natural disasters present very different challenges. On the natural disaster side, it's really, some of it is around logistical challenges, right? How do you get the right amount of things to the right people in the right time? How do you not duplicate effort with other organizations? So there's a lot of collaboration. In times of conflict, what I find challenging is that you're reminding people of commitments that they made when they weren't as angry as they are in the present. And you're reminding people how to have conflict in a way that we agreed to. So I think that's an enormous challenge. Maybe be more specific if I didn't answer your question. Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about when I was in Nepal. I was actually in Nepal with another organization, so it wasn't with the Red Cross, although we saw you know, other Red Cross national societies there, some who were specializing in search and rescue, because there was a lot of urban, like, the coordination in that you've got language barrier, you've got expertise that you have to coordinate. The UN does cluster meetings where you're bringing all the people who have a specific interest or specialty, and you're coordinating. So I would say it borders on the miraculous that we can have that level of coordination in a natural disaster so quickly. And so we do a lot of that work that happens in the day-to-day is to practice the response, but it's still chaotic. It's still chaotic. You still have to walk into it, and you have to have enough people skills to be able, and enough, and not ego, right? So no ego to be able to walk in, and there's no room for savior complex, right? You have to know what you're good at. You have to be humble enough to know what you're not good at, and you have to be able to walk in there and offer what you have to offer. And I think it's both challenging and miraculous that happens so well.
So one of our Human Rights and History graduates asks online, does the American Red Cross work with Native American reservations?
We do.
Mm,
Easy answer.
Maybe a little bit more.
Yeah, I
Like,
know.
elaborate a little bit more.
We do. Yeah, so we definitely do. And I would say that we would like to work more deeply. We would like to continue to create those connections because the tribes come with their own individual kind of challenges. They're looking at things through their own lens. And part of being a good partner is listening first, right? To listen to what they need, what they articulate that they need, and then having the long-term relationship where it's not transactional, where it's a genuine relationship so that you can benefit each other. And that's where the Red Cross is. And I think we have, I think in some places we've done that much better than others. I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I would say it's a little bit of job security for our volunteers and for myself included that we have more work to do because we don't have the strongest relationship with every group in the tribes. And there's a lot of tribes.
Okay, thank you. So I'm wondering what happens to Red Cross ambulances in conflict zones. What happens if they become the target of a bombing or if they're the target in war? They're supposed to be out of it. They're supposed to be the neutral parties. What happens in such circumstances?
So it's illegal to target an ambulance. It's illegal to target anything that has one of those symbols on it. And so it's an illegal action. So we can start there. Past that, it does happen. It happened recently and it's tragic. There's nothing good about it. I think that's, when we talk about heroes, I think a person who has volunteered to drive an ambulance, knowing the risk that they have to their own life, it's heroic. And
what's the response of the International Committee of the Red Cross or maybe the national level Red Cross if there's some kind of attack on such?
As a person who does not represent the International Committee of the Red Cross or the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent, I would let them answer like their official response. But it's condemnation. Like we put out statements that remind people this is not the world we agreed to have. This is not the way in which we agreed to have conflict. So it is, there's
no suing mechanism, taking states to courts, damage of property, violation. Is there any way to?
There are mechanisms and those wheels of justice take a long time, like years and decades. And so if we're talking about what's the response in the moment is to acknowledge the tragedy of it, to condemn it publicly and forcefully. But in terms of like repercussions for it, those repercussions are long off, if at all.
If at all. Yeah, if at all. Dr. Coate.
If I were
Yeah. Yeah. So I would
learn other than the Human Rights and History minor. I mean, let's be real here.
Honestly, I would learn French. So, anybody know French already? So yeah.
Yes.
So the international work happens in English and in French. The International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescents has 2 official languages and it's French. So being fluent in French is a big part of what you can do right now to get ready. Past that, policy, become an attorney, like you can study emergency management, you can become an expert in the field. There are PhD programs in emergency management now. There's a lot of pathways to get there. My pathway, sadly, it turns out I'm old these days, and my pathway was unusual for what is it currently for somebody to get into this. I would also say, because it's a 90% volunteer workforce, if you want to get on somebody's radar for a job, start volunteering and raise your hand at every time, at every moment that you can. And there are people here that want to see young people in these roles who are passionate. And I think one of the things that we do really well is clear the obstacles for people to go into this work. You know, the UN meets in New York. That's not that far away. There's an IFRC presence there. There's lots of opportunities to do this. One of the things that when I was back in San Diego a few years ago, we had there was a national call for creating an app, and it was a contest for an idea. Like, think of an idea that can help young people figure out how to be more resilient in their home country with different sets of resources. And we had a person who said, "Can I do this contest?" I said, "Of course you could do this contest." She won the contest. They flew her to Geneva, Switzerland. She got to present this to a global panel of young people and young leaders and global Red Cross. So there are opportunities. It's a matter of like being exposed to that. Is that okay? Yeah.
But first you should do the Human Rights and History
But
Minor,
first you should do this.
obviously,
That's right.
obviously.
That's right.
But so just to remind you from my comments at the beginning, 2 students who've graduated with the Human Rights and History minor have done an internship. It's a kind of volunteer / as all interns do, a research project, which I supervise. At this point, I'm the only one supervising these. So that's something, if somebody's interested in kind of thinking in that direction, we develop research topics together. You work with Kurt and you work with me. So certainly that is an option for anybody who wants to pursue this. Yeah.
And I would say, like, be a self-starter, like start asking questions. Like there's lots of options.
Yeah. Yeah. Margie?
You see Mark.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say, unfortunately, we're becoming quite good at knowing where those lines are. So as a volunteer, we ask for usually a 2-week deployment. So if they travel from Maryland to go to Hawaii for, the wildfire in Hawaii, we would typically do a 2-week deployment. And that's typically where the emotional toll of that starts to weigh. We have had people deploy all the way to Guam, so that's a much higher expense for the organization to send people there. So that might be a 3-week deployment. But we actually have like our mental health professionals as volunteers, who part of their job is not just people who are affected, but also our workforce. So we work really hard to make sure we don't have burnout. And when we do, we try to take care of our workforce. Yeah. There's one, right?
You have a question here? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about working with refugees.
Sure.
Right. For refugees.
I mean, I think one of the things that I would say off the top of my head is, when you have a refugee coming into a world that's not theirs, creating systems and structures and support, like as many partner agencies and partner organizations because there's a lot of organizations that will have a piece of what they need. So helping them navigate, whether because it's the language barrier or just the cultural barrier, like helping them piece together, like create their own puzzle of all these organizations that have a piece of what they need. That's probably the most critical thing. And not get impatient, because they're going through some pretty serious psychological things as well. So, yeah.
Yes, Patty.
I apologize. If you assist with that.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So the Red Cross typically works with a government agency. So like either the local, county, state, or federal to work on transporting people out of evacuation zones. We as an organization, that's outside of our mission. But what we end up knowing is here's where the people are, right? So our part in that partnership is here's where all the people are who said they can't leave because they don't have transportation, and communicating that to the agency that does have the transportation. It's typically a county or even the state that will rent buses and get them out there. Yeah. Well, so some of it's because, it's these same areas that are getting hit again, right? And so we have the 30+ years of data that we've collected, and we've become quite adept at doing disaster assessment as one of our volunteer opportunities. And we can both, so the technology is coming where we have satellites, right? And so if you can tell from a satellite image that this entire neighborhood is affected, that's where we're seeing those. So we have partnerships with NOAA, like Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We have, we're certainly talking with FEMA on that front. Like, there are these partnerships, and the other flip side of that is boots on the ground, right? So we have people that are literally going out and saying, I can get to this street and I can't get any further. So we need to figure out how to get in there. So, and that's the beauty of the local Red Cross, because we're literally we have volunteers in every community, right? So they know their neighbors, that information flows up, and we've become quite adept at doing that. Yeah.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I want to thank everybody for coming. If you're interested in the Human Rights and History Minor, grab one of those expensive cards that Dr. Coate allowed us to make. They have a couple of QR codes on them. One of them is for our Instagram page. I hope you'll follow us. One of them is the website to the Human Rights and History page. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, Dr. Katz, in the History Department. You can call the History Department office. My email is kkatz@towson.edu. Please join us and talk to Kurt a little bit more, especially if you're interested in an internship where you have a little food out there, and it would be great to talk to you a little bit more informally. I'll just say one last thing. Tomorrow night, the Muslim Students Association and the Towson Freedom School and a few other organizations are organizing a student-run program. They've invited me to talk more about what's going on in Israel and Gaza. If you're interested, that's going on in Lecture Hall 238 at 6 o'clock. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you in the hallway.